Hey guys, how's it going? This is Natnator. Welcome back to your weekly dose of Creepypasta. Now, today's story was written by one of our very own TeddyDog. It's a fantastic story, and I hope you'll all show him some love down in the comments section. Also, I do want to add a disclaimer / trigger warning for depression and suicide. If you'd rather not hear about things related to that, you might want to skip this one. And a less important disclaimer is that I did some more accents in this one, and I hope you'll forgive me for doing possibly the worst British accent I've ever heard. So, as a Brit might say, allow it fam. Okay, before we jump into the story, I want to thank the members of the Coven over on Patreon. Shoutouts, as always, to the Disciples, Tiffany, Backwards D-Dog, Vera Ohio, Jelly, Jim Jam Bonks, Amberly Perry, TeddyDog, Brooklyn Gonzalez, Patrick White, Jacob Stringfellow, Backapuff, and Jacob Nasa. Thank you guys so much, and again, many thanks to TeddyDog for providing this evening's entertainment. Now, as always, turn out the lights, get comfortable, and let the story begin. I'd like to keep my name private, but many Creepypasta listeners may recognize my pen name, Grin in the Dark, which I lifted from a novel by my favorite author, Ramsey Campbell. I'm not a professional writer by any means, but I've had remarkable luck in getting my stories read by some of the more popular narrators of the genre. Many kind words were spoken of me, and I replied with what tried to be great wit, aided by a wide vocabulary. I watched as many new channels as I could, and offered praise and encouragement, and tried never to overlook an opportunity to amuse. Their gratitude when they were the first recipient of a new Grin in the Dark confection tended to fill me with embarrassment and shame. I wore a tissue-thin, smiling public facade I felt sure any moron could penetrate. Now, the truth is, I suffer from a disease called clinical depression, which has made my personal life as circumscribed as a prison cell. Any genuine friends I may have once had were alienated long ago. And women? Well, what a catch. A depressed middle-aged man that lives on a miserly disability pension and hates the whole damn human race, including himself, mixed with not one or two, but a whopping 4 suicide attempts to his credit. In addition, I come with the guaranteed assurance my disease will deteriorate over time, and I'll be impossible to either live with or to love. Psychiatry had given up on me a lifetime ago and fobbed me off with pills. The state-mandated electroshock therapy added a new dimension to my stunted personality. I was now subject to bright flashes of red, which were of breathtaking depth and beauty. However, they were accompanied by a cyclone of murderous anger, whirling as widely as the sky around a thick frozen core, which seemed to control the entire tempest. Controlled, yet rabid hatred and rage, followed by 2 weeks of unbearable remorse that I had not hurt or killed somebody during my seizure, or my possession, as I prefer to call it. I wept at the absence of blood on my hands. I'm not sure if this new dimension to my nature is an improvement or not. I'm depressed, so I don't really care. I knew I lived on a planet removed from any other human being, which was even more for me to ignore. While I was recovering from the electroshock, my sides would cramp and I would scream at the sensation of being sliced in two, with blades slashing into my sides. I experienced true starvation. What it was I starved for was pain, revenge, and slaughtered human meat. Fortunately, these episodes were brief and no harm worthy of mention came to anyone as a result. With the exception of Creepypasta, I had no life outside my apartment, and to me, it felt like safe harbor. Kindness and decency are the minimum requirements for acceptance among creeps. I can approximate both. Friends were easy to make and keep, and no ugly feuds between celebrity phonies troubled the mood. Best of all, they accepted most of my stories fairly often, though. I typically believed many were accepted out of pity and friendship, rather than any merit the stories actually had. Since I have no life, where do I get off creating stories about it? My mother was the other portion of my life. She lived 20 minutes away in her own small apartment. We were good friends who'd loved each other for my entire life. But she never mourned not becoming a grandmother. She understood I was too crippled inside to provide that to her, and accepted it with grace. She was clearly in her final years, and visiting her brought us both happiness. As for my father, he passed his genetic inheritance onto me, and childhood memories of him are few. There's just a single moment of one day. I still see the rope around his neck, and the kitchen table turned on its side. Mum was now in her early 90s, and the deterioration of her mind had grown impossible to ignore. The apartment had become filthy, and my mother had begun to repeat herself constantly, and age began to mark her face. This was the long goodbye, and I was the end of our line. The most recent time I'd been at her home, I saw an old beat-up used car, special blue Toyota with California plates, parked in my mother's well-populated cul-de-sac, and I thought no more of it apart from a fleeting reflection that I hoped I would be there when it tumbled into the abyss. I returned from my mother's house and went directly to my creepy world as always, and soon froze in place as I began to read. Every credit with my name on it was attacked, and in visceral terms. I was horrified to read the epithets "Mama's boy" and taunts of "Mummy's house for dinner" and "can't get it up," though there I felt they were just guessing. The name attached to this oil slick of commentary was Tara Reads. Within a day, the comments were removed with profuse apologies, which were both expected and accepted. But this had just finished when a new tsunami came in that ripped across the comment sections. All were focused on what a shitty writer I was, the ultimate fraud and poser, whereas people like her, just as for instance, could write honestly about life in the real world. I've always found those who prattle on about how real they are to be full of shit, but then I don't mix much. I didn't even know what real life is all about, she declared. She got that right, I guess. A half day of stopping these attacks passed only to have them resume almost immediately. I understood all hands were on deck in Creep World, and they were doing all they could, but it was a day of misery nonetheless. And the only way to bore this bore from our midst we did by discussing the upcoming CreepCon in a beautiful hotel just one state away. How much voice talent would be there? It seemed like dozens were planning to stop by at some point. They're as damaged as me, I thought, as I contemplated my own anxiety in the proximity of other human beings. Fortunately, Tara Reads lost interest here, or at least stopped posting. These people were different. These were creeps and horror fans whose names I knew, and the kindest, most tolerant group imaginable. I would go to the convention. I would give experiencing and enjoying life another shot. The big night came and I was there clutching my ticket like a life raft. I stamped on my Grin name tag and fled the lobby, which was too bright and loud, and followed the arrow to a ballroom where the door swung open. This would be the chill-out room during the convention, and served its purpose well. No sooner had I entered, I heard laughter beside me, and an unmistakable voice good-naturedly say, "Oi, it's you! Grin in the dark, how you doing, man?" I turned and greeted the Professor, whose British accent was silky and smooth, and who wore a friendly grin with amused, possibly stoned eyes. For some reason he wore a Gilligan hat hitched back on his head. Younger than me, but not by much, generationally speaking. More significantly, he was probably the most recognized of all the narrators, but was talking to me like he had no place better to be. I asked if he liked my latest submission, and he laughed and said, "What? You mean the one where the little demon baby explodes up through the landlord's asshole? I almost puked. Thanks for that, brother. You're a serious danger to yourself and others. You know that, right?" "Yes, I'm narrating that one. And hey," he said, taking on a concerned and sympathetic expression. "Now, I saw some of that shit you went through last week, and I sympathize, trust me. That same woman dogged me throughout my early years. She wanted to be a writer, but..." Here he scoffed humorlessly. "Her stories were all identical. They all starred her," he said, ticking off his thumb. "And a complete stranger she's torturing to death for no particular reason except to come up with new ways to torture people," ticking off his index finger. "She genuinely is sick, and you can believe I was on a plane that same night I discovered she knew my home address. However," he pointed out slyly, "the Professor is a hard man to track as well as expensive." He winked conspiratorially. "Whoa," he said, rising suddenly. "Now this is the man you want to talk to." He called over a tall, neatly dressed man whose channel was new but good and very promising. We shook hands and he said, Yeah, she's dangerous. After I wouldn't read one of her stupid stories, she actually started stalking my family, threatening my kids. It ended with the cops chasing her off into the wilderness in January. She's dead for sure, I thought. We all did. Cops, everyone. Then I read the things she was saying about you. It's her, most definitely. It's no copycat. Suddenly, the air was split with thunder in the form of a human voice with a thick Texas twang, and even I had to smile ear to ear. It was Tyrannosaurus Tex, teller of some of the most hilarious stories I'd ever heard in my life. "Well, paint my ass Pank and call me Janet. It's His Holiness the Professor himself, and, he squinted at my name tag, resplendent in his 10-gallon hat, ZZ top beard, and boots which went jingle-jangle. "Grin in the dark," he erupted with recognition. "I put her there, partner," he said, and shook my hand with such vigor I felt I was aboard a ship in stormy seas. "I just want to say what an honor it is, and go fuck yourself." "If he could do that, why would he be here with us?" the professor asked. "I, for one, would never leave the house. We were just sharing Tara Reid's horror stories. Seems our friend is the latest target of her wrath. No joke, man. Tread carefully." With his face taking on a look of great solemnity, Tex said, "Well, that is sage advice, buddy. I can only assume you showed him who specifically to be on the lookout for, right? Why, I feel impotent just asking such a thing." "That's impudent, Shakespeare," the professor said as his brow furrowed and he began scrolling through his phone. "I've got a whole file on here somewhere. Friends close and enemies closer and all that. Ah, here we go. If you see this face heading your way, I'd run." He handed his ludicrously complicated device to me, and I squinted, then slowly sat as my legs began to tremble. I knew this face, and what a disagreeable one it was. It was a woman who looked all of 10, but was, according to the mugshot, about 30. Puffy, squinted eyes glared back at me, and inward-sloping ferret-like teeth showed between pursed lips. She managed to look arrogant, insulted, and furtive all at the same time. Evidently, Tara Reeds was an alias for Agnes Peterbottom, and no wonder. What a dumb name, I muttered, unaware I'd spoken aloud. Well, keep reading, the professor advised. There is some scary shit in there. And so there was. The professor had clearly hired a very thorough private investigator who had opened an entire barrel of worms. She'd been arrested, jailed, released, escaped, institutionalized for things like assault with intent to kill, endangering the welfare of a child, numerous illegal firearms charges. In one instance, she'd been caught sawing through the steel rod of a magazine publisher's car, for which she received a whole 2 years probation. My eyes bulged and my jaw dropped as I read on. Text advising the professor on the therapeutic benefits of rinsing the sand out of his vagina faded to a low murmur as I read how she'd begun her inglorious career as a nurse in psychiatric hospitals all over the Northeast. And in my jumbled, hallucinatory way, I remembered. I was in the enclosed wing of a psych ward outside Boston. Painful, surgical staples, keeping the canals I'd gashed into my arm shut. The pain had been excruciating, keeping me awake one night, so I rose from my narrow bed and ambled down the dark hallway like a zombie. Just one room was brightly lit, and it drew me like a moth. I stared numbly as the tiniest nurse on earth stood at the foot of the bed of a patient who appeared comatose. Holding his IV in one hand, she pulled a vial of white powder from a purse slung over her shoulder. My dry mouth found its voice, and I began to howl for help, frantically slapping at the alert button on the pendant around my neck. I heard stampeding feet approach as the piggy eyes and pursed, sneering mouth of the nurse whipped to face me. And so help me God, she growled and gnashed her teeth at me. Soon orderlies poured in, and I was hustled back to my room. About 20 minutes later, as I told the head nurse what I'd seen, an air raid siren, which slowly transformed into a voice which rattled my fillings, filled the air, shrieking mad threats and choruses that reached a crescendo when it arrived at my room. "You!" the awful instrument grated. "I will destroy your whole world. Do you hear me, you freak? I will destroy your whole world." I refused to turn my head, in no mood to look into such malignancy and spite again. Dazed, I read on. Agnes Peterbottom worked at several psychiatric hospitals in the New England area and was dismissed when a sharp spike in patient deaths was shown to coincide with her period of employment, though no formal charges. It was exactly then that my own phone began to ring in a loud, unfamiliar ring. I yanked it from my pocket, and black tendrils of smoke drifted up behind my eyes, and I felt icy steel swelling up throughout my core. Emergency police communication. Respond immediately. My screen read. Next, I was outside my mother's house, being told by someone that it had been easily entered, and she'd been taken by complete surprise. Not hard to do to a partially deaf 93-year-old woman. Though she was frail and elderly, her killer had strapped my mother to the bed tight, blood-constricting knots, strapping her arthritic arms above her head. For nearly 2 hours, the killer had inflicted terrible tortures on her, until at last, my mother's aged heart stopped in shock, freeing her from the nightmare smashing down the walls of her confused, innocent mind. The ice blooming within me asked, why do this on a day when for the first time in years, a room full of people can alibi you? Answer, she doesn't want me locked up in a cell as a suspect. She wants me to herself. That's fine. The wall of swirling red rose behind my eyes. My mind roared with multiple voices, demanding violence and death and blood, and starving voices wailed behind them in the urgency of their hunger. Did my mother have any enemies? The police asked me. No, I said. Did I? They asked. No, I said. After the funeral, I vanished, but not before entering my home to pack a few things. I unlocked the dust-encrusted basement window. Then I shopped for tools. Behind my house is a ragged grassy hill leading into spindly and widely spaced trees, which give way to denser forest and thick, towering trees, with a canopy that leaves the forest dimly illuminated, even on the sunniest day. As one who's lived his life alone, I have wandered these forests, which stretch to the horizon in every direction, and know them well for miles around. It was in the first clearing that I pitched camp and began to saw at a 10-foot length of wood. Did I mention I live in northern New Hampshire? Lumber products of every length and width, and I chose carefully. When night fell, I pulled on some rubber gloves and placed a terrarium I'd purchased in the center of the clearing. Then, flashlight in hand, I began checking under rocks. I did this until the light grey of dawn appeared through the narrow gaps in the branches, and my once empty terrarium was teeming with frantic, agitated life. I pitched camp and slept the sleep of the just and the dead. I let her see me. I knew true to form, Tara Reeds, aka Peter Bottom, would make camp in my home and strike when the moment was right. I would offer her no such moment. I had now been away nearly 4 days, and she had begun to sweat. She had left her car, a beat-up blue Toyota with California plates, wouldn't you know, at a campground 2 miles down the road from my home, which she slithered into when she discovered the deliberately unlocked basement window. But by day 3 of haunting an empty house, she was really starting to crack. I watched, well hidden, at a strangely tiny head bobbing indiscreetly up and down in my windows. On day 4, I let her see me. When her head bobbing routine began, I dashed along her line of sight, ducking behind one tree, then another, putting on a show of being stealthy and furtive. Then I beat a hasty retreat into the woods. There are basically 2 trails which lead into the deeper woods. One I made sure to block with enough loose shrubbery to render it invisible. Of necessity, she'd have to follow the path where I sat motionless behind a knoll, surrendering my mind to gorgeous towering walls of roiling red flame. I had become like a golem, a creature of Jewish myth made of clay from unsanctified graveyards where murderers lay, and are then animated by black sorcery and sent into the world to kill. It is their sole reason for existing, and they are indestructible. Reduce them to dust, and that dust will reconstitute back into the golem. I was both dead inside and consumed with the imperative to kill and kill and kill, and I felt the kinship. I didn't have to wait long. She entered the clearing, making all the racket a human in an unfamiliar forest makes, and was entirely unprepared for my body leaping from my hiding place, crushing her tiny body to mine, as my free hand dug a taser viciously against her neck. She spasmed in my arm as I shocked and shocked her again, until she collapsed onto the ground unconscious. I looked down on her tiny body, which looked just like a child's from behind, with all the mad and ravenous voices baying and bloodthirsty approval. The quality of mercy had long ago turned to ash inside of me. The twit had a butcher's knife slid into her belt to hunt me with. I pulled it free and slashed all her clothes from her body, taking great care to be as careless as possible, jabbing and slicing her flesh as I cut the clothes away. On her back it became obvious this was no child. Her fluttering eyes remained just as mean and piggy as I recalled. Her small, pouty mouth, filled with tiny pointed teeth, sneered at me, but sheer terror was far more in evidence. She looked like a foul-tempered rodent that was slowly regaining its senses. I accelerated the process by pulling a heavy steel mallet from my own belt and smashing it down on each of her kneecaps until I heard a slow, ugly cracking noise. She let out a loud, sustained howl, and her eyes rolled up in her head. I watched vomit splutter up over her lips. She gagged and coughed on the rest as I gripped her short blonde hair and dragged her bloody, naked body into the clearing, where I bound her wrists tightly in a loop of leather, which cinched right as I pulled the rope attached to it, hitched it over a tree branch, and slowly lifted her to her toes. She was awake now, and I heard her shrill nasal voice begin to taunt me. Was this the way I got my kicks? Could I only get it up by tying up injured naked girls in the woods? God, I was so pathetic, etc., and what have you. I was stiff as a truncheon, sure, but not for the reasons she imagined. I had no James Bond villain speeches to make. I only spoke 5 words to her the entire time. Are you afraid of spiders? I asked, while pulling on my rubber gloves and reaching behind a stone which concealed my terrarium. The answer was apparently yes. Her eyes bulged so widely, I wouldn't be surprised if they'd popped. The cage was half filled with wolf spiders, which thrive in New England forests in autumn, which this conveniently was. They are as large and ferocious as their name suggests. I found many as large as my palm. The females were even larger than that. Their young traveled on their abdomens until they were large enough to devour their mother. The color of the wolf spiders covered the full spectrum of dark brown to pitch black. I had enough to grab them by the fistful and fling them onto her body, one fistful after another. The enraged creatures fanned out across, over her breasts and up her neck and onward into her hair. One even found a home splashed across those sneering, pouting lips. It would seem I had captured myself a dedicated arachnophobe. She swung and thrashed and wept and even prayed. After seeing my mother's lidless eyes staring cloudly and dead at her bedroom ceiling, I couldn't imagine divine intervention for Tara Reid's being imminent. Her thrashing only served to further agitate her coating of massive spiders, which retaliated by driving their bone-hard pincers into her flesh and dangling from her body like strange fruit. I returned to the rope and untied and pulled this wicked crone in a child's body about 10 feet into the air, secured her, and walked behind a large oak. Her now rasping screams and pitter-patter of spiders which lost their grip on her and fell to the earth were the only sounds I heard. Before my depression fully consumed me, I'd shown an aptitude for carpentry and tried to be a productive member of society by practicing it. Well, that idea quickly died as my inability to get out of bed on many days stymied it. But I stayed with it as a hobby. Like my stories, it had kept my mind from consuming itself, focusing on something beyond my inner darkness. For even a mediocre carpenter, it's an easy matter to carve a pedestal and a sharpened stake to fasten on top of it. And this was what I carried from behind the oak and placed carefully below Paige Turner. I untied her rope and slowly lowered her body, which remained blanketed with scuttling, biting spiders, onto the very sharpest point I could carve. By now, her screams had shredded her vocal cords, and she scarcely sighed as the wooden pike slid into her from behind and slowly, with a wet ripping sound, stabbed its way through her belly. Untying her and letting her stand on her own, I observed with satisfaction that the spike truly seemed to not have punctured any vital organs, meaning she could dangle there for hours, or even days before infection, shock exposure, or even spider bites killed her. To her, it would seem far longer. I was satisfied. I was calm. The clamor and flames licking my brain had vanished, and for once I felt easy in my own skin. It was a restrained euphoria, but euphoria nonetheless. Slowly walking back to my home, Tara Reid's impaled and forgotten behind me, I plotted my future. I knew my depression would be back, but I also knew these woods. I knew where people hiked and camped. I knew dune buggy trails, where teenagers would go party and fuck, and I had plenty of lumber and plenty of rope. If I was focused and methodical, I could keep what Churchill called the black dog of depression at bay. My deeds could be legend in these here hills. I would live on beyond my death after all, and I would never, ever lack inspiration for my multitude of creepy friends. I smiled. Damn, it's good to be alive.